In August of 1945, a worn Boeing B-17 reached the end of its usefulness at Albuquerque, New Mexico. Its serial number was 41-2666. 2 years earlier, Japanese fighters had struck it nearly 200 times with machine gun fire and 5 times with cannon shells. Fire had broken out inside it, its controls had been damaged, 1 man had been killed and several others wounded. Yet the aircraft had survived, been repaired, and returned to service. Combat did not destroy Old 666. Peace did. The airplane was sold for scrap 6 days before Japan announced its surrender. No preserved airframe remains. That ordinary disposal created an extraordinary contradiction. Old 666 is remembered for its reconnaissance mission over Bougainville, but the machine itself vanished into the post-war scrap system. To understand why it became famous, it is necessary to separate the aircraft from the legend that later grew around it. The popular story says that Captain J. Zeamer found an abandoned bomber in a boneyard, gathered a crew of unwanted airmen, and rebuilt the wreck almost from nothing. It is a powerful image. It is also too simple. Aircraft 41-2666 was certainly worn. It had been damaged, repaired, transferred, and used hard in the Southwest Pacific. It had developed such a poor reputation that a photographic reconnaissance squadron recorded its return to another unit with visible relief, calling it Hard Luck Hattie. But it was not a dead airframe lying in pieces. It had been flying photographic missions shortly before Zeamer took responsibility for it. What followed was not a resurrection from scrap. It was a frontline conversion of an aging but operational machine. Zeamer and his crew needed an aircraft for a difficult kind of work. They would not be flying as part of a large bomber formation, surrounded by other B-17s whose guns could protect one another. Their task was long-range photographic reconnaissance. That meant flying alone, far beyond friendly fighter cover, while carrying cameras over territory defended by Japanese aircraft. The crew was not simply trying to build the most heavily armed B-17 it could. The aircraft still had to carry cameras, fuel, ammunition, and 9 men over great distances. Every change had to balance range, reliability, photography, and defensive fire. All 4 engines were replaced. Nearly 2,000 pounds of unnecessary equipment were removed, including parts of the normal ammunition feed system. Ammunition would instead be supplied from boxes placed near the guns. The camera installation remained. The defensive armament did not. Twin machine guns strengthened several positions. Extra firepower was placed in the radio compartment and at both waist stations. Most unusually, a fixed forward-firing 50 caliber gun was installed for Zeamer to control from the cockpit. A pilot could not swivel that gun independently. To aim it, Zeamer had to point the entire B-17 toward the attacker. The modification gave him a way to answer a head-on attack with more than evasive movement. It did not turn Old 666 into a fighter, but it gave the pilot an option that an ordinary reconnaissance bomber did not possess. Old 666 carried 16 mounted 50 caliber guns. Later accounts often give 19, apparently by counting 3 spare weapons carried aboard. 16 mounted heavy machine guns were already an extraordinary armament for a photographic aircraft. Before the mission that made the aircraft famous, Zeamer flew it on mapping work over New Ireland and the Admiralty Islands. Old 666 had already proved it could perform as a specialized camera ship. Its most dangerous test had not yet arrived. That test came in June of 1943. American planners needed photographic coverage of the western coast of Bougainville, including the area around Empress Augusta Bay. The photographs would be joined into a broad record of the coastline and terrain for future operations. Reconnaissance of the Japanese airfield at Buka was added to the main assignment. On June 16th, Old 666 left New Guinea with 9 men aboard. J. Zeamer was the pilot. John Britton served as co-pilot. Ruby Johnston was the navigator. Joseph Sarnowski was the bombardier and nose gunner. George Kendrick was the photographer and also served as a gunner. Johnny Abel was the flight engineer and top turret gunner. William Vaughn was the radio operator. Herbert Pugh manned the tail. Forrest Dillman served as a waist gunner. 2 regular members of Zeamer's crew were absent with malaria, so Britton and Johnston joined the mission as replacements. Dillman was added to strengthen the crew. Old 666 had to cross about 600 miles of open water to reach the target area. There would be no escort waiting over Bougainville. If Japanese fighters appeared, the B-17 would have to defend itself. Even with its added guns, the mission contained a deeper problem. Photographic mapping demanded a steady aircraft. The camera images had to overlap so they could be assembled into continuous coverage of the coast. Sharp turns could interrupt that sequence and leave gaps in the map. Turning away too early might preserve the aircraft, but reduce the value of the entire flight. The camera run therefore limited Zeamer's freedom to maneuver at the moment maneuvering might have made the bomber less predictable. Old 666 reached Bougainville and began its work. Kendrick and the camera equipment recorded the ground below, while Zeamer held the bomber on its plotted line. The aircraft had already crossed hundreds of miles of sea. Now, for the photographs to be useful, it had to remain steady over defended territory. The additional reconnaissance at Buka placed the aircraft near a Japanese airfield. Official American accounts state that the crew observed about 20 fighters, many of them taking off. The threat was visible before the mapping work was finished. Zeamer continued the run. The first fighters approached while Old 666 was still committed to the photographic course. Sarnowski and the forward gunners met the initial attacks. Other crewmen engaged from the turret, waist, radio compartment, and tail. Now the alterations made in New Guinea became part of the battle. When a fighter came in from the front, Zeamer could bring his fixed gun to bear by aiming Old 666 itself toward the attacker. The bomber's nose was no longer defended only by men firing flexible guns from inside the compartment. The pilot could use the whole aircraft as the gun mount. But the added weapons did not create an impenetrable wall. The fighters could attack from several directions, separate, reform, and return. A gunner who turned toward one aircraft could leave another angle less protected. Old 666 was large, heavy, and much less maneuverable than the fighters around it. It was also alone. Its survival still depended on keeping 4 engines running, preserving enough control to fly, and preventing a concentrated attack from damaging something essential. Then the Japanese fighters coordinated a frontal attack. Cannon fire entered the nose. Joseph Sarnowski was struck and mortally wounded. The force of a shell burst knocked him backward into the passage beneath the cockpit. Despite the wound, he pulled himself back to his gun and continued firing. His official citation credited him with engaging another attacker before he finally collapsed over his position. The same attack severely wounded Zeamer. Gunfire and fragments struck his arms and legs, breaking one leg. The cockpit and control area were damaged. Rudder pedals were shot away or rendered unusable. Hydraulic, oxygen, and interphone systems were hit. Fire broke out behind the pilot's position. Until that moment, the crew had been fighting to complete a reconnaissance mission and escape. Now the aircraft had to be kept airborne, while several of the men responsible for operating it were bleeding. The frontal attack broke the normal organization of the crew. The interphone failure isolated stations from one another. The men could no longer depend on a clear voice from the cockpit telling every gunner where the next attack was forming. The oxygen system fire threatened the aircraft from inside, while fighters were still attacking from outside. Damage to the controls made every maneuver harder. The navigation equipment was also affected, creating a second problem that would remain after the battle ended. Ruby Johnston had suffered multiple wounds around the head. Blood interfered with his vision. He continued firing until the shell burst in the nose threw him into the passage. When he saw the fire behind the pilot's seat, he pulled out the burning oxygen bottles and extinguished the flames. Then he returned to the work of navigation. William Vaughn had been wounded in the neck. He continued at his gun until the fighters broke away. After that, he used the radio to warn possible landing fields that the aircraft was carrying seriously wounded men. With normal navigation instruments disabled, he remained at his post obtaining bearings for the return. Johnny Abel had been shot through both legs. He continued manning his guns without first announcing the wounds. Later, when Britain needed to leave the controls to help the injured, Abel took over flying the bomber for part of the journey home. Herbert Pugh remained in the battle, helped care for the wounded, and watched for landmarks that Johnston, half-blinded by his injuries, might not be able to see. The crew no longer operated as 9 men confined to 9 assigned positions. Each failure forced another change. The navigator fought a fire and returned to navigation. The radio operator became the link to possible landing fields. An engineer became an additional pilot. A tail gunner became an observer and attendant for the wounded. Old 666 had been modified around the idea that more guns might compensate for flying alone. After the frontal attack, survival depended on something the modifications could not provide. Damaged machinery and wounded specialists had to be replaced by the men who could still act. The Japanese attacks continued. Zeamer remained at the controls through the running fight. His Medal of Honor citation records that he kept maneuvering the damaged bomber so the gunners could answer successive attacks. Only after the fighters had broken contact did he turn over the controls, and even then he continued directing the return while drifting in and out of consciousness. American award citations later credited Old 666's crew with at least 5 fighters destroyed and others damaged. The exact Japanese losses remain uncertain because wartime claims were not always confirmed by records from the opposing side. After roughly 40 to 45 minutes, the attacks stopped while the B-17 remained in the air. By then, Old 666 had absorbed nearly 200 machine gun strikes and 5 cannon hits. The total alone could not show which impacts were superficial and which struck something essential. What the crew could see were damaged controls, failed systems, fire, wounded men, and an aircraft that still responded when someone moved the controls. Surviving the fighters did not complete the return. Old 666 was still 580 miles from the base named in Zeamer's citation. There was no emergency runway beneath the aircraft. The crew first had to determine where the damaged bomber was, hold the course toward New Guinea, and preserve enough power to reach land. Sarnowski was dead. Zeamer was severely wounded. Several others required treatment. Britain was now responsible for much of the flying, but he could not remain at the controls every moment while the wounded needed attention and the aircraft's condition had to be managed. Later crew interviews identify Abel as the man who held the controls for about 90 minutes, despite wounds in both legs, while Britain helped elsewhere. Meanwhile, Johnston continued supervising navigation despite his head wounds. Pugh watched for landmarks and relayed what he could. Vaughn collected radio bearings because the instruments normally used to establish the aircraft's position had been disabled. The return was not one continuous act of a single pilot. Control, navigation, communication, first aid, and observation passed among the men according to what remained possible. Zeamer had led the aircraft through the battle. Abel helped keep it on course. Britain prepared to bring it down. The coastline eventually appeared. Reaching land solved only one part of the problem. Old 666 still had to be aligned with a runway and landed with damaged controls. Its hydraulic system had been hit. The flaps and brakes were not operating normally. Some official summaries compressed the final approach into Zeamer landing the aircraft. Later accounts, based on interviews with the crew, identify Britain as the man at the controls when Old 666 touched down at Dobadura. Britain later remembered the landing with pride. The aircraft came in fast, without normal use of flaps or brakes, but the damaged B-17 remained under control. Old 666 had crossed the water, completed its photographic work, survived a coordinated fighter attack, and returned with most of its crew alive. Sarnowski did not return alive. For their actions, J. Zeamer and Joseph Sarnowski received the Medal of Honor. The other 7 men aboard received the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 Medals of Honor and 7 Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded for the same mission. The decorations recognized the crew. They did not retire the aircraft. Old 666 was repaired. The damage was severe, yet the camera ship was restored to flying condition. Its unusual additional armament was later removed. The changes that had defined Zeamer's version of the aircraft were not preserved as a permanent configuration. Old 666 returned to photographic service because, during wartime, a repaired aircraft was still useful. That continuation is easy to overlook because the Battle of June 16th feels like a natural ending. It was not. The mission that made Old 666 famous became one episode in a longer service record. The aircraft flew again in the Southwest Pacific. It later returned to the United States in March of 1944 and moved through additional units and bases as the war approached its end. The aircraft survived first as a machine that could still fly, not as an artifact that had to be preserved. By 1945, Aircraft 41-2666 was an early, heavily used B-17 moving through a system preparing to dispose of surplus equipment. No museum acquisition or preservation effort appears in the surviving record. Old 666 entered the disposal process as a machine the military no longer needed. On August 9, 1945, it was sold for scrap. To the system processing it, Old 666 was no longer a camera ship, a heavily armed field conversion, or the aircraft that had carried 9 men through the reconnaissance mission over Bougainville. It was worn military equipment. The airframe disappeared, but the story did not. Its serial number remained in movement records. The crew's actions remained in award citations. Photographs preserved the shape of the aircraft and the faces of the men who flew it. Flight logs, squadron reports, and later interviews preserved details that popular retellings sometimes changed. Those records show why the true story needs no boneyard legend. Zeamer's crew did not create an aircraft from a pile of discarded parts. They took a tired but operational camera ship and altered it for a specific danger. They replaced its engines, removed weight, changed the way ammunition was carried, strengthened its defensive fire, and gave the pilot a gun he could aim with the entire aircraft. The result was not invulnerable. The additional weapons could not prevent Sarnowski's death. They could not protect Zeamer and the other wounded men from every attack. They could not keep the controls, oxygen lines, hydraulics, and interphone intact. They gave the crew more ways to resist. Then, when the machinery failed, the men changed roles and continued the work themselves. The fighters over Bougainville failed to destroy Old 666. Its wounded crew carried it home. The Army repaired it, and the aircraft flew again. What combat could not finish was completed 2 years later in an Albuquerque scrapyard. The crew became part of aviation history. The airplane became metal.